Okay. Welcome and thank you for coming. I'm Director of Program Management in the Microsoft Expression team, and we make tools to enable you to create great user experiences and to keep design well integrated into all phases of building an app. In this session, I want to introduce you to an exciting new flavor of Expression Blend, Blend for HTML. A new visual authoring tool to create, style, and edit Metro-style user interfaces for Windows 8 in HTML and CSS. Most of you may know Expression Blend already as our premier authoring tool for XAML. And with Blend for HTML, we are applying the same principles of design-centric visual creation and great integration between design and development to the world of HTML and CSS. In this session, after a little bit of background, we are going to spend most of the time with a demo of building UI for a little game application, for a casual game, beginning with just semantic markup and backing JavaScript. And I hope you walk away with that Blend is really the tool to give you better UX at lower cost and with better productivity, and most of all, with a lot more fun. So let's start with a little bit of background. Historically, HTML is about content presentation, not about application. After all, the language was created as a markup language for authors to describe documents. And only over the last 5-6 years, it has become a platform for apps, beginning with what today we would call AJAX apps like Outlook Web Access, Gmail, Google Maps, that in many ways resemble desktop apps more than websites, especially in terms of the UI patterns they are using. Applications are different from documents. They use very different design patterns. They are interactive, dynamic. Their interactivity is client-side. And most of all, they are built around a rich framework of UI controls. Because of that different character of apps and the document-centric nature of HTML, UI for apps in HTML usually relies a lot on JavaScript. And that makes it a very code-centric domain. That, in turn, has an impact on design in the process. Once production of an app becomes entirely code-centric, design is often at risk to be diluted or to disappear. One reason is that design is really a mindset. But in a code-centric process, there are also many less opportunities for the stakeholders of design to participate directly in the process. And code is often not the best medium to express design in the first place. So our goal with Expression is to help maintain design presence throughout the entire development process by providing visual authoring of production quality artifacts that still plays well in a code-centric environment. So what is Blend for HTML? Blend for HTML is a native HTML authoring tool designed for Win8 apps. By native, I mean there's no translation from XAML, it's not an XAML authoring tool that exports to HTML. It really is HTML ground up. It's all HTML inside and CSS. It's designed for people who want to visually create and style production-grade UI for Win8 using HTML and CSS. And most importantly, it works even if your app relies on plenty of dynamic UI generated in JavaScript. Blend is also a professional design tool, and it expects good knowledge of the HTML and CSS platform. So Blend does not abstract away the platform. It gives you all the power of it. It gives you access to every single bit of it, but it lets you focus on the concepts, not on the syntax, and it gives you immediate and constant visual feedback. Also, it's designed for smooth workflow with developers. Let's look at some more details. One of the core things in Blend for HTML is an accurate, high-fidelity design surface. There is no emulation. All rendering uses exactly the same render engine that your final application uses when it runs. One big issue for fidelity is all this JavaScript-generated UI we were talking about before. In traditional tools, that usually doesn't look all that good, and you cannot edit it very effectively. That is because traditional tools just look at the markup. They just look at the HTML and CSS. And now in these JavaScript-centric apps, that's only one small portion of what makes up the UI. And all the divs and other tags are often just placeholders for controls. And without running the code that backs these controls, you really don't have any meaningful rendition of the controls. And often you can't even see the layout, because in order to lay out the controls, all the content has to be generated and has to be produced before you can calculate the bounds of the object. And Blend solves this problem. It solves this problem by running the code of your app, your controls, on the design surface at design time, all the time. Because of that, the UI that you're designing can render and be edited exactly the way you have it intended. Let's look at that in a screenshot of an app in a traditional web editor. In this case, this is our own Expression Web. Expression Web was designed for building websites, not for building applications. And as you notice, you see pretty much nothing. You cannot really tell even what app that is we're trying to design. The reason for that is that this app is made from lots of dynamic controls that do pretty much everything in code and very little in markup. If I show you that same app as a screenshot in Expression Blend, it looks very different. Again, the reason for that is that we're running all the client-side JavaScript, and as a result, we're seeing all the data-bound controls and the list, and even this chart that is actually generated as a canvas just with JavaScript code. And clearly, this is a little bit more useful if you want to do visual design than the previous screenshot. So a couple of more things. One of our design goals is to be able to do production quality markup without magic, things that are predictable and efficient. I should say, though, that in this preview that is not all completed, so your mileage may vary in the preview. A big part of Blend for HTML is styling, CSS styling. And styling, by the way, in CSS, of course, includes layout, which is very, very cool. And we're focusing very much on styling for applications. For example, on the layout side, we have built very deep support for the new CSS3 layout mechanisms, that is the CSS Grid and the CSS Flexbox, that makes it really, really easy to create complex resizable layouts as they are typical in applications. We've also built Blend to effectively style both dynamically generated UI and static UI. And of course, there's lots of support for Windows 8 features, JavaScript controls, view states, orientations, and so on. One very important aspect of all that is that apps have many dynamic states. And most of these states don't have any static representation in the markup. They can only be reached by interacting with the app, by triggering code, by changing the data model, and so on. For example, your app might have a flyout that shows the current state of some computed data, and there's nothing in the markup that actually describes the state of the app. And usually that means that in a visual authoring tool, there's nothing you can do about it. Yes, you can create the CSS or the markup, but you can never see how it actually looks like and directly manipulate that. Blend solves that problem with interactive mode. Interactive mode lets you basically interact with the app as you design it, as if it was running. And if you reach a particular state, you can just freeze it with a stroke of a button, including platform states that are transient, such as hover and things like that. And then you can just continue to interactively edit these things using that frozen state as your new departure point. And that's an incredibly powerful way to visually author apps that have lots of dynamic UI. Last but not least, Blend plays really, really well, just like Blend for XAML, with Visual Studio. We're using the same project format, so there's lossless transfer between the two products. And it's very, very efficient to use Blend for design-centric tasks and VS for code-centric tasks. And you can do that even on the same machine by just opening the project at the same time in both products. Here at Build, you probably already all have on your tablet a Blend for HTML because it's part of the Windows Developer Preview. In case you haven't found it, it's in the start screen. Just look for the tile with the very short name, Expression Blend 5 Developer Preview. And as you explore this, please keep in mind this is not a feature-complete product. It is a preview, and it will still evolve over the coming months. And of course, we're very much looking for your feedback as well. I'd also like to say that the version of Blend in this preview is HTML only, so no XAML included, and we have not released a version of Blend 5 for XAML yet. So at this point, I want to show you the app that I'm going to work on in this demo. So let me first get this beautiful red demo slide, and then go to our start screen and start my memory app. Oops, 1 second, let me do that again. Okay, that was what I was looking for. So this is a simple memory card game. In this card game, we can just start it by pressing the Start the Game button. Timer starts ticking. And now we can just flip over cards to try to find matches. I hope I find one now. Yay, here is one. So, and that way you can just play the game. To make this game a little bit more challenging, we can stop it and just switch to a larger game size. So you can do 6x6 and 8x8 cards. Let's go back to 4x4. Restart the game, and if I play here, I can also click on these pictures to see the pictures enlarge. And very importantly, this game also plays well with all the different view states and orientations that an app can have in Windows. So if I go here, and I drag in another app and I snap this other app, you see that my layout just adapted nicely, so it got a little bit less wide, and my game cards became a little bit more square, so the layout just automatically adapted. But what if we bring this app into snap state? So let me just drag over this. And now you see that we got a completely different layout for the app. So instead of having our UI at the left, as before, we're now having the layout on top, and we have actually hidden some of the UI elements. This is basically a completely different layout that I could specify right in Blend, so that if we get into snap state, we have a different layout. There's another layout that, or rather orientation, I should say, that is supported. Let me just, go back to my desktop. I can't show that on a laptop because I can't put my laptop in portrait orientation, but I can show it to you in Blend, and so this is kind of like the sneak preview of a part of the demo I'm going to give you. In Blend, you can basically see the application in all the different states using the platform panel as a preview. And in this platform panel, so this is the app as it would look normally in its landscape state. And this is how it looks in Portrait. And again, in Portrait, I changed the layout of the app so that the UI that before was on the left is now on top and arranged a little bit different. And here are the two other states and the snap state. So that's basically a very cool thing that you can do in Blend. You can easily design these things, but we'll look at that later in the demo. Now that you know what we're going to work on, let me go back to my presentation for 1 second. So this little app at some point began its life as a sketch like that. And I could certainly have created, like a high-fidelity Photoshop comp and just given it to a developer and say, hey, please build that for me. But I really didn't want to do that because I wanted to design the UI myself, but I didn't want to write the code. So I gave that sketch to a developer and I said, hey, please give me just semantic markup that expresses the logical structure of my app and give me the backing JavaScript to make it run, but don't give me any UI. Basically, I wanted an engine and a drivetrain, but not an entire car because I wanted to build the shiny metal myself. So, and that is really a good design practice to do, and it's actually very common in the web world. Separate your semantic markup and your logical structure of the app from the UI that you define in CSS. So let's look at what we got back from the developer. So this is the semantic markup that we got back. Again, there's nothing about UI in here. This is just semantic markup specifying the logical structure of the app and of the pieces of it. And if you look closely, nothing in this markup is actually specific to Windows 8. This is just fundamentally basic plain HTML. And there's one important message that I want to give in that, and that is that Windows 8 HTML apps are first and foremost plain vanilla HTML and CSS. So every bit of skills that you have in designing HTML, in designing CSS, and working with JavaScript works when you are building a Windows 8 app. There's no magic and nothing new to be done. This is an example of the code, and here the same thing happens. This is just one function. This is actually a core function of the program. That's the function that generates the game board. And again here, this is just standard DOM manipulation JavaScript code, nothing special, nothing fancy, and any skill you have in writing DOM walking code and code that modifies the DOM will just work in a Windows 8 app. My developer also gave me one more thing, and that is some annotation scribbled right on top of my sketch. And we're going to come back to the slides a few times while we're doing the demo. This is basically just information that tells me about the hooks that the code gives me to connect my UI to the different states and the things that are happening in the code. For example, that set of annotation tells me that cards, when they are closed on the game board, have a class assigned to it that is closed cards. And when I peek under a card, I get a class assigned that is open card. And when I have found a pair of cards, the class that is assigned is found card. And I can use this information to then create styles in CSS to actually change the UI and build the appropriate dynamic behavior in my app. So with that, without further ado, another pretty red slide to tell you that I'm going to do a demo. So let's bring up Blend and bring up exactly what I've shown you before. This is basically this clean, simple semantic markup, just basically running. And I told you before that this clean semantic markup actually is a running application. It works perfectly well, even if it has a completely useless UI. And I can prove that to you by either running this app so that it gets built and deployed in Windows, but because this is a demo of Expression Blend, I rather show you one of the many uses of interactive mode. So I'm clicking on this little green arrow icon here, and that switches the app in interactive mode. What that means is the app now runs, and I can interact with it. So I'm just clicking the Start the Game button, just as I did in the demo before. And something really dramatic just happened. The timer starts ticking. Also, I can go down here, and currently all I see of my card UI is a bunch of URLs. If I click on two URLs that are the same, like for example 14 JPEG and 14 JPEG, my found counter and my attempt counter both counted up, so I just found a card match. Yay, that was not very challenging. So let me do something wrong. And if I go to 17 JPEG and 1 JPEG, I get 2 attempts and just 1 found, because that obviously isn't a match. So let's switch back from interactive mode. So what you've just seen is that this app is actually running here right now on the design surface, and you can interact with it. And if I switch off interactive mode, now we're in design mode. But if you notice here, let me zoom in again, the timer is still ticking. So even when I'm not in interactive mode, all my JavaScript code is running. Because really the difference between interactive mode and design mode is not if the JavaScript code is running or not. The difference is if you can interact with it or not. Thank you. So we can just let this timer happily click and have the app wonder, why is nobody playing with me while we're interacting with this? And the first thing we want to do with this app is just change some colors and some fonts to make it look not quite so 90s, early 90s that is. And we could do that all ourselves by making all kind of CSS definitions, but Windows actually already provides a theme file that has a lot of these color and font definitions already done for us. And given that we want to make an app that actually complies with the design guidelines, it's probably a smart choice to just use that. And we can just add this file to our document by just clicking here in our styles pane. Actually, before doing that, I should explain what the styles pane is. The styles pane is basically the place in Blend for HTML where you can organize all your styles that play into the design of your page. So it basically gives you a tree view that shows you all the style files and all the styles and all the media queries included in it in that project. Right now, as I told you, what I got from my developer is totally CSS free, and really there's just one empty style rule here, and you can see that it's empty in this tooltip, and really there's nothing else there. And so to begin, as I said, I want to add this style sheet from Windows. I can click here and say link a style sheet, and now I can either pick one that already exists or create a new one. In this case, I want to pick one that exists and pick the Windows theme file uidark.css. And if I hit OK here, you see that my app just time warped out of the 90s. By getting a more modern font and like having the buttons more metro style and all these things. So let's zoom out here that we can see that better. So next step is to start playing a little bit with the layout. Let me zoom this a little bit so that I can see everything. Here down here, this panel is our live DOM. That basically shows me the structure of the app. And this element here that is called game body basically contains all the UI elements this app is made of. And as you can see from the adorner, this doesn't really fit into the frame of my device right now because it's too big, so I really would like to restyle it and make it fit. Now, looking over here on the other side is one of the hard pieces of Expression Blend, the CSS Properties Inspector. Here you can basically work with all the CSS properties, edit them, and so on. And you can see what is very important, and that is the section here on the top, which style rules are actually applied to a selected element. In this case, because we don't have any CSS yet, there's really nothing applied to it except inline styles. Every element has inline styles, but inline styles are really not a great design practice to edit. So for me, the quickest thing to get this thing rolling here now would be to just put CSS styles all over the place inline into my HTML. But again, that's really bad design practice because it it violates the separation of like UI in a CSS style sheet and semantic markup in your HTML file. So instead of doing that I really want to have a style sheet that I use to define all that. And so I go back to my styles panel and say, link a style sheet. I'm going to add a new style sheet. And this time I'm just going to create one, and I'm going to call that demo UI. And now that shows up here as well. So now we have 3 style sheets assigned to this app. At this point, it's time to zoom out so that we can see something. Actually, I need to zoom in again because I want to show you something else. Here in this Applied Styles panel, I now have a shortcut that lets me very quickly generate a new style rule that targets this particular element. I can just click here, and now it says, create a style rule from the ID of the selected element, which happens to be game body. And if I click that, I automatically get a new style rule. Let me open this here in my style file. And it is automatically selected, so now I can just happily style away, and I can be sure that the styles, the declarations I'm generating do not end up in my inline style, cluttering my HTML with all kind of goo that I don't want there. So in this case, I want to do something only very, very simple. I want to go to sizing and set the width and height of this element to 100%. So now you see that the size of my adorner fits exactly the frame of my app, but it doesn't quite fit in. And the reason for that is, and that's one of the peculiarities of a CSS, is that this H1 element that is the memory title basically has margins for top and bottom assigned, and these push down this body. And to fix that, let's select the title. We can just do that here on the artboard and do exactly the same thing that we've done before, create a rule for it. And now that we have this rule, I can go to my layout category here and just set the top margin, oops, not to 0, but to 0. And while I'm at it, I'm going to set the bottom also to 0. And now my game body fits perfectly. OK, now it's time for some serious layout. You remember from the demo of the app that we want a layout where all the UI is in a column at the left and the title is on top, and all the rest of the space we want for our cards, and we want this to be resizable because this app, of course, needs to work on a 10-inch slate, and it needs to work on a 27-inch monitor or any other format in between. And this type of UI, resizable and dynamic, is actually tricky to do in CSS, at least in the traditional CSS. But CSS3 adds these really, really cool layout techniques, the CSS Grid and the CSS Flexbox, that make this type of resizable application-style layout really, really easy. And we're going to use that here because we're supporting that really nicely. So in order to make this game body element into a grid, I need to go and take the display property and set it to grid. Oops, I have done a real rookie mistake. I haven't killed my email before starting. Shame on me. Let me set my display property to MS Grid. And that has probably not improved my overall layout. As you can see, all the elements have just piled up there in the upper left corner, like a little traffic accident on an LA freeway. And the reason for that is that by default, my grid has only one row and one column. And it basically says, hey, any element that doesn't tell me otherwise gets assigned to the upper left corner and assigned and aligned at the upper left corner, and that makes them all just pile up on top of each other. That's not very helpful. So let me just hide all these UI elements for a second. Actually, let me zoom in for a moment. We have these little eye toggles in our object tree that basically let you hide elements just temporarily at design time so that they are not in your way if you don't want them. So I'm just going to hide all the content of my little element. And as I now hover over the adorners of my grid, you see these orange lines show up. And these orange lines are basically insert cursors that let me insert rows and columns. So I should backtrack a little bit. The HTML, or the CSS grid, is basically similar to a table in that it is a row-column-based layout container. But it is very different in that it doesn't do anything to your markup. It's a pure CSS-based technique. And also, it is a lot more flexible in the way how you can define how your layout resizes when you resize your app. Basically, you can think about it as something that you can create a red line document like you would do, on paper as a designer, and then use these guidelines that you create to lay out your content, and it will all resize just the way you want, as I will show you in a second. So what I want to do here is I want to just start creating a column and make this a little bit smaller like that, create another column for my UI, maybe like that. You can see as I drag, I can actually see the size of that with the little adorners I have there on top. Give myself a little bit of a gutter space here. I want the baseline for my title. That probably should be, according to guidelines, around 100. Some space for my subtitle, another little gutter, and let me just zoom out here. So I need a little section on the bottom and a section to the right. So now, this really looks like a little layout grid, my custom layout grid that I can use to lay out things against, and that's really what it is, and it's really practical. But let's look at how it resizes. So now if I take this and I start dragging this, you can see that these rows and columns all resize proportional to each other. That's really not what I want. Let's go back for 1 second to my final application and switch that back into this mode. As I resize that, and the easiest way to show that is with our platform panel that lets you basically preview how your app looks on different screen sizes, I really want that my UI, as I resize the app, stays exactly the same size, and I want all the extra space to be used by my cards, right? So let me actually zoom out so that you can see this. So this is on a 2560 by 1440 monitor. This is how it would look like on a 1920 by 1080 monitor. And this is how it looks like on a 1366 monitor. As you can see, the UI column and the title column never changes its size. It's just the content space that adapts. Going back to my demo file. So there's a really easy way to make CSS Grid have this behavior, and that is by just setting all these columns, instead of being fractional sized, which is relative resizing, by just setting them to fixed size, which is called pixel. And I can just do that with this onObject UI here by just clicking on these columns and just toggling them from fractional to pixel. And one more, and this one over here as well, and this one. And if I now go and resize away, you see that these are now frozen and they don't resize as I'm resizing this app. And that's very, very cool because that's exactly the layout behavior I want. Now that I have that done, it's time to position all our elements in that grid. So we're going to start with the title. Let's make it visible again by toggling the eye. And again, by default, it's still sitting in the upper left column. And to position it, I can now use the grid properties and just move that thing over a couple of columns like that, and make it aligned with my grid properties to the bottom of this row. That's not quite right. I need this to align properly with the baseline, so I can just drag here my number around and just make sure that it properly aligns like that, and I'm done with the title. Next thing, subtitle. Selecting the subtitle, making it active. Now the subtitle doesn't have a style yet, so I quickly use my shortcut UI, just as we have done before, to create a style rule for it. And now I'm going to position that over into the same column and move it down one row. A little bit of adjustment to be done. I don't want any margins on that. Oops. I also don't want any bottom margin. I want it to be aligned to the bottom of the row, and I just want to make the font a tiny little bit bigger. So let's just drag the font to, let's say, 18 pixels. And that's our subtitle. Next to do is our settings UI. So let's make that visible. This needs to go in the column here at the left. So same ritual that we've done before. We create a style, and we just take our grid properties to move that over one column and down a couple. Now, as we look at that, that is in the right position, but the buttons really don't look very good that way. We really would like the buttons to fill that column. So I could now go and select every button by itself and bring it into the right position, but that's not particularly elegant. Much more elegant to use CSS class selectors. So I can just select these three buttons, like this, and go to my HTML attributes panel. And in the attributes panel, I can set the class to any value. So in this case, I want to call these guys game buttons. And now these all share a common class. And once I have a common class, let me zoom out, I can basically create a CSS rule that addresses all the elements with a common class. And again, I have a shortcut to create such a style rule so that I don't have to type it in. I can just go here to my shortcut UI and say, let's zoom in again, create style rule from selected element class. And in this case, I can choose the class. I only have one. I use game buttons. And let's zoom out. Now I have this new class for game buttons, and if I select that class, you see this green adorner that is around the buttons. I hope you can see that on the screens. The screen adorners that basically shows me which elements are targeted by the rule I have selected. And that is hugely valuable when you have complex selectors, because you can basically see, oh, these are all the elements that will change when I make a change to this particular style. So when you're working with CSS, that is really invaluable. So now that I have these three elements targeted by a rule, I can just make a change in this rule by setting these guys to 100%, so they all have the right width. And I also would like them to be of a little bit different height, so I'm just going to make these a little higher so that they are easier to touch with my finger. And I should probably add some margin at the bottom so that these guys don't sit like right on top of each other. Now, at this point, there's all kind of little details to fix. Like, this game size title is a little bit too close, is a little bit too far away from the button, and the radio buttons are too close to the next button. And none of that actually adds any value to this demo, because you have already seen me do all these similar things. So I have already made a little CSS file that has this definition that does that stuff already, and that also arranges the other parts of the UI. So let me just do one more thing. I just add one more column here, one more row to my grid. And then I'm just going to add this style sheet to arrange the remaining two pieces of my UI, the stats and my game board, in the right places. And then we can focus on more fun things to do. So I'm going back here and say link a style sheet. I'm picking an existing style sheet. I called that stats and board, and just add this to here. And all this style sheet did, it changed some margins here of the game size and of the radio buttons, moved the stats UI in the right place, and moved my game board into this space. And now we're going to come to the fun place, and that is actually styling the game board. So the game board is interesting for two reasons. One reason is that it's all generated in JavaScript, so it's dynamically generated content. The second reason is it's a lot more interesting layout. So let's first look at it here in our live DOM tree. So if you look at, let me zoom in for you. If you look at these elements, you see this little lightning bolt at the side of the elements. And what this lightning bolt basically tells you is this element doesn't exist in your markup. It is dynamically generated in JavaScript. So none of these elements in this whole game board area, like all these individual divs, the game grid itself, actually exists. If I select one down here, this is the element, this is the paragraph tag that shows the URL. This is all generated in JavaScript. But I'm going to show you now that you can style against these things in just the same way as you can against anything else. So let's zoom out. Let's begin with making these cards a little bit more visible. Each of these divs is basically one card in the game. If I bring up my slideshow again and go here to this slide that has all the information, my developer let me know kindly that all the cards have a class assigned to it that is called game item. And I can use this class to style again. So let's do that. And let's check that in the HTML attributes. Indeed, here's a class called game item, so I can just use that to create a style. So I go back to CSS properties, use the same shortcut UI we've used before, create a style rule from the selected element class, game item. And now I click that class just to show you that this really addresses all the game items. And I can just go ahead and give these guys a background color so that we can see them. Oops, that we can see them better. So I'm just going to make these gray and give them some 50% opacity. Now, that is clearly not the layout I want. I wanted a layout where this is 4 by 4. And what I'm going to do to make that happen is I'm going to use what is called a flexbox. So this game grid element, basically I'm going to convert that into a flexbox, and I'm going to do that in exactly the same way as I did that with the grid. I'm just setting the display property to MSBox. So flexbox is a proposed CSS spec that was contributed by Mozilla, and it's basically, think of it as a stack panel on steroids. It basically it stacks elements basically either vertically or horizontally with all kind of extra features to make that stacking better controlled. So you might say that making that into a flexbox hasn't really improved things a lot. Let's select this style again. So you can now see that all my cards are now stacked horizontally from the left to the right. But that clearly isn't the look I want. But I can make that a little bit better, first of all, by adding a little bit of a margin. Oops, that was bottom margin. That was not what I want. I wanted right margin. Adding a right margin to these so that we can actually see the individual cards. But most of all, I want to make this flexbox multi-line. And luckily, it has a feature to do that, so I can just go here and set the multiple lines feature, and that's already a little bit better, but I want 4 by 4, not this layout as it is. And the way to do that is to make every card just the width so that 4 of them fit into a row. So the entire flexbox is 100% wide, so I need to make every card 25% wide in order to get 4 of them into a line. So I'm just picking my game item again, go to width, and make that 25%. Oh, wait a minute, why doesn't that work? The reason this doesn't work is that I have added a margin to these elements, so 25% makes it actually bigger. I can't fit 4 of them in a row anymore because the margin is in the way. And in order to fix that, I'm just going to make the size a little bit smaller, and once I'm at 22%, it just fits nicely. So now I have my 4 by 4 layout. So far, so good, but if I look back to my game grid, I now see that these elements don't actually fit my grid. And luckily, Flexbox has a feature for that. If I go back to my game items, if I set the flex property on these, I can tell the Flexbox to take on all the remaining space and just fill it up. And so now I have these things aligned the way I want. Good. So now it's time to replace the URLs that we have in these cards with actual images. And before I'm doing that, I want to do one more thing. I also want to set a height for all these cards and set this to 100%. And now we do the images. Let's go back to our slide for 1 second. The developer also told me that all the content that is in each of these cards is copied from an element in my HTML that is called card template. So there's some code that when the game board is generated, looks at whatever content is inside of that element card template and just copies it into every game element that gets created. It's just cloning this template as many times as I have cards. So let's look what is in this card template. And this card template, not surprisingly, contains a single P. And that is exactly the P that is showing up here as a dynamically generated element inside of the inside of my cards. And if I just delete this P from my markup, all of a sudden there's nothing in these cards anymore. What I really want in this card template is an image tag. So I can go to my asset tag, and I can just create HTML elements very quickly in Blend by just using the asset tag. In this case, I want an image tag. Here it is. I just double-click on it and regenerate my page. And now I have the images on the card. And if we look at the markup again, in my game grid, I now have the dynamically generated elements, and instead of a P, there is now an image in here. Now the images are clearly way too big here. So I have to size these down. And the first problem I have to solve for that is I have to find a style rule that addresses the images. If I look here at my HTML attributes, the images have no class because they are dynamically generated. They also don't have an ID. So how do I address these guys? And this is where CSS selectors really, really make my day. You can think of selectors as queries. So I can query an element I know and then find all its children and say that I want to change all the children. So let's get first a selector again that finds all the cards. That's the same that we've done before, the game item selector. And now I just modify this selector and tell it to look at the children that are of type image. And now this selector actually really just addresses all the images. And you can see that if you look here at the object tree, when I open all these cards, you can see the green highlight of the images that just says, this selector says, hey, find all elements that have the class image tag, game item, and then find all the children that are of type image. And now I can style these images. And I can say, hey, make the maximum height of these guys, maximum width of these guys 100%, and make the maximum height of these guys 100% as well, so that they fit in their parent. And now I can actually see these pictures much better. Let's go back to game item and center these. I'm going to cheat a little bit here. I'm going to use the real simple way of centering something by just setting text align to center. That's not an ideal way of doing that. For example, that doesn't do vertical centering, but I'm going to save the time to do it right in this demo because otherwise we don't have time for more fun stuff. Now, the game as it is right now is probably still a little simplistic given that you can see the content of all the cards, so finding a match is not particularly challenging. So the next thing we really should be doing is to hide some of the cards. Again, if we look at our sketch, oops, not that sketch, all the cards, when they are closed, have a style applied to it that says closed cards. And when we peek under a card, we get a style applied, a class applied open cards. And if we have a pair, then it's the class found cards. So that we're now going to use to basically do the appropriate styling of the cards when they are open and closed. So let's first look at one of the cards. I can just pick any of them and look at my HTML attributes. And if we look at these, indeed there is a class game item and a class closed card. So the first thing we want to do is, the first thing we want to do is we want to create a selector, a CSS selector that gets me all these closed cards. I do this by just creating a style rule with the same shortcut we've used 20 times today. And I say closed card. And if I select this style, you see it finds all the cards because currently all the cards are closed. And now I can style these and, for example, make these transparent. I can't remember where my opacity property is, so I just type here in my search field, and here it is, and I just force it to 0. That's probably not what I want. I don't really want to hide the cards. I just want to hide the images. So I pick my selector here, closed card, and just add an image at the end to just address the images contained in the cards, and that gets me basically all the images in my cards to be hidden, or rather to be transparent. Now, how do I now style the other two cases, open card and found card? All my cards are closed. The answer to that, of course, is interactive mode. So I'm going to go into interactive mode and start playing my game. Start the game, and now I just need to find a pair. Hopefully that will not take me too long. Did I have that guy? No. Oh, that one I had. Yay. So now I have two cards that are found. So these should now have the class assigned found card. And I'm also going to just open any other one. That one should now be open card. Let's go out of interactive mode. And if I now select this card and I look into my attributes, indeed, as we had expected, this now has the classes assigned game item found card. This is because the underlying code, when I click on a match of two cards, replaces the class name closed card with the class name found card. And when I just open a card, like for example in case of this one, the code replaces closed card with open card. And I can now use these styles to style again. And again, in a normal authoring tool, I couldn't do these things because I could never actually interact with my code to make these dynamically generated JavaScript elements actually be in the state I want to. I cannot edit these classes manually because these elements don't even exist in my markup, so there's nothing to edit them. And that is incredibly cool that I can do these type of things. So let's get out of here with a zoom and let's actually start styling. Let's first do the found cards and go back to CSS properties, do the same thing, shortcut, create style rule from selected element class, use found card. Nothing special here. Let's select found card so that we see it better. Clear our search for opacity and change the background color to green and make it a little bit opaque. And now let's do the same thing with open card. I need to use this element. Create style rule from selected element open card and select that style rule and just make it yellow. Okay. Now let's go back to interactive mode and see if we can actually play this game. So now I can just click things, and maybe you notice that I'm back at exactly the same state where I was before. I didn't have to rerun my app. I didn't have to press F5, like run a browser again and see my thing. I just continued at exactly the same state where I stopped before. So I can literally switch in and out of interactive mode all the time and edit a little bit, then bring my app into a different state, go back, edit, go back into the state where I want to be. And it's really, really fluid and easy to do these things. And it's a very great experience. The problem with this now is that while it all works, all the cards come up very abruptly. So there's no transition, no animation in there, and that's not very pretty. So next step, we want to do some transitions. So let's get out of interactive mode and look at how we do CSS transitions. So let's first do the images. So we select a rule that basically picks all the images we have on the game. And now we find our CSS transition editor. That is down here, and I'm going to zoom in that you can see it. So CSS transitions are basically, think of them as like something that watches in the background, and it says, hey, whenever a given property changes, instead of changing the value immediately, change the value over time, with some little animation. And we can basically tell it for which properties to look. So the first thing we want to do is we pick the property we want to do, and in this case, this is going to be the opacity because that's what we're changing on the image. So I'm selecting opacity, and now I can use this little mini timeline here to basically drag out the length of my transition for this property. In this case, I want like 0.8 seconds. I could also move this here in time and change the delay for that. And this is basically just a fancy editor for the properties of CSS transitions. I can also set an easing function. CSS transitions define a bunch of little easing functions so that the transition doesn't go linear but has a little bit of acceleration and deceleration. And that's kind of cool, so I do that. And you see the little icon here, updates. And we want to do the same thing. Let me zoom out here. The same thing for the background color on the game item. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add a property, in this case background color, make it also like 0.8 seconds, and give it some ease in, ease out. And if I now go back into interactive mode, the next cards I pick, they just come up with a nice little transition. So that whole thing is a lot prettier now. Thanks. So now we're already pretty far with our UI. Next step, let's just do something a little bit more visual. I want to have my logo in my app. So let's find the game board, the game body here again, and let's zoom out a little bit like that. And in my asset panel, I not only have the HTML elements, but I also have all the images in here. And I know that my image is a PNG image, so instead of browsing, I can just type in a search string. And now I see all files that have anything with PNG in it, and here are a bunch of little things that I have. And I'm just going to use this logo here that is 120 by 120 and just insert it into my document. And because I just inserted it into a grid, it just shows up here very squished into the first row column, which is not very pretty. And so in order to position it more nicely, I'm first going to give this element a name, call it logo. With our well-known ritual now, create a style rule for it. And now change its positioning. In this case, because I know that this always is going to be in the upper left corner that never resizes, I can just use absolute positioning for this logo, which takes it out of the grid and lets it position however it wants. And when something is either positioned relative or absolute, I can just drag it and position it on the design surface however I want. So I'm just going to move this here in the right spot where I want it. Let's see, how am I doing in time? Oh, not so good. I could now also set the background color. You've seen that, we have this, where is it? Here, this background color under the image. I'm going to skip that just in the interest of time. You've seen it before in the final app, and it's not a big deal, but it's a few steps to do. So I'm going to skip these for now and do some more interesting stuff. There are two more things we probably want to look at. One thing is, you remember from the running app that I can have my game board not just in 4x4, but also in 6x6 and 8x8. Let's see what happens when we go to interactive mode and actually do that. So I stop my game and I switch to that. And you see that the thing relayouts, but really not in the way I want. Because the layout now is 4 by, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 4 by 9 instead of 6 by 6. Not what I want. So how do I do that? Well, let's go back to our annotation here, and let's look at what happens when we change the size. And my developer told me that when the size of the game is changed, there's a class changed on an element between small game, medium game, and large game. And I can use these classes to basically change the layout of my game board to match. Okay, let's do that. Let's first find out where that style is actually set. So let's go out of interactive mode. And let's have a look at where is it? Game grid. If we look at the attributes of it, we indeed see, where's my zoom button here, that the class is now set to medium game. And again, without interactive mode, I could have never gotten into this state, so I could never have styled against this. I have just used interactive mode to interact with the code of my app to create a dynamic state of the app that was completely unreachable statically, so that I can now style against it and visually see what I'm actually doing when I'm styling this. So let's zoom out here. And now I need to create some style rules that addresses medium game and does something different in there. So let's create a style rule for medium game. And just for the fun of it, instead of using the shortcut, I'm just going to type in the style name. So I can just do this and type medium, if I could type, medium game. And so this style rule now addresses the game grid. The problem is that the style I want to set in order to change the layout of these elements really is the cards that are inside of the game board. So I really need to address these guys. And I know that each of these elements basically has a class of game item. So I can get these if I just change this selector here into .mediumGame.game item. And basically what I'm telling the system now is that find the element that has the class medium game, and then find all the children that have the class game item assigned to it. Now that I have that, I can just go back to my CSS properties and just adjust the width of each element, because now instead of getting 4 in it, let's type in again 22%, because that's what we had before, I can just go down with the size so that I fit more elements into this. And at 14%, basically I can fit 6 in it, and I'm done. And I could do exactly the same thing for large game to get, like 8 of them into that. And that way I have I've styled against this dynamic game board and gotten things done, which is really, really cool. So the next interesting step is to deal with the different views. So let's go to our platform panel that we've seen before and see how this app does when we change the views and orientation. Let's first go to portrait. Well, that is what the current automatic layout does, the way we've done it when we go to portrait. And that's not particularly pretty. Clearly, we're not using the space very nicely for this game in this way. And as I've shown you before, really the right layout decision here would be to just take this game UI here on the left, where the buttons are and where the stats are, and move that on top of the cards, so that the cards are more square and that the space is better used. And the way how you do this is, every time when an orientation changes, a media query is set. Media queries are a standard CSS mechanism to create different layouts or different styles for your document or for your markup, depending on in which environment it is. The classic use for media queries is printing, right? So you have a media query for screen, when your app is shown on a screen, and you have one for paper, for print, where you would do something completely different to lay out your page to be printed. And we're using exactly that same mechanism for media queries that basically say, hey, when you are in portrait, have a different media query. When you are in Snap, have a different media query, and so on. So you can just basically override the styling decisions you made for one mode in a different mode, which is a very, very nice way to adapt your styling. Now, I could do this here with this app, but because this app has lots of style rules and I have very little time left, I'm going to do that with a slightly simpler example. But before I'm doing this, I'm going to show you the final result of doing this here. I prepared already a style sheet that has all these media queries set. And I'm just going to add this to this app, and it's called Memory Dark Views. And as I add this, and I go and switch into portrait, you now see this appear in the right layout. Let me just show you this file so that you have an idea how these things look like. Memory Dark Views. Here it is. So this is the declaration of a media query. Let me zoom in so that you can see it better. This is And if that magnifier UI goes away, you can see this. This is a declaration of a media query. So this one here, for example, says, for all media, no matter if you're on print or on screen or whatever, and if the orientation is portrait, then apply the rules that are in there. I'm using here one that is specific for Windows 8 that says media all, and when the MS view state is device-portrait, then use all these rules. And just as in a normal CSS file, all the content here is just CSS, and you can edit it in exactly the same way as we've done it before. Visually, you don't have to use any CSS for that. So let me show that to you. Let me open my simple, let me first zoom out here again. Let me open my simple example file for that. And let's play around with the platform panel. So this is the example in landscape, and this is how it looks when we switch to portrait. The elements in this example are just positioned absolutely, so they get just cut off when I go there. So let's first look what we have here. So in the styles panel, we have a CSS file that has already a media query in it for portrait, and it has already a few styles in this. Let me show you this file just so that you see it. This is basically just all empty. There's nothing in these guys. So now let me just show you how you change these things. So go back to my example file, and I switch to platform portrait. And if I now select an element here, you can see in the device panel that I now have the styles that come from the normal style sheet, which is example. Oops, wrong button, sorry. Let me zoom in. You have the styles that come from example.css. Let me get this out of the way. And you have the one from the views file, which is the media query. Let's switch to normal mode. And if I switch to normal mode, the one from the views file doesn't exist. So basically, depending on which view you have, you get additional style rules that you can use. So I'm going back to portrait. And now select the rule. Let me zoom out here. That's easier to see. Select the rule that comes from my media query. And now I can just move this guy around. Let's do this with the next one, with the green one. Again, select the rule from the media query. And let me show you what has happened. So just by moving these guys around, I have now changed these style rules that are inside of the media query. I'm just going to do that for the remaining elements. I'm going to pick this guy and move it over here as well. Take the container, use its media query rule. So I just have to pick the right rule and make sure that I'm actually changing the rule that is inside of the media query. Do this one as well. And I'll just resize that. So it doesn't actually matter if I override properties that are already set somewhere else, or if I set new properties. Any property that is in the media query gets applied when the media query is active. But media queries, and that's one thing you need to keep in mind, are applied in order of declaration, just like anything else. You always have to make sure that your media queries actually come after your base declarations, or they won't be applied. And now if I switch back from, between these two views, you see that the layout actually switches. Now, one fun thing I can do is I could actually use CSS transitions to make that transitioning. The reason why this works in this case is that I'm just using absolute positioning for that. So if I just define here in my base style sheet, I have here a rule that applies to all elements. And if I go to my transition editor, I have here a property value that says all. I'm just saying all properties. Make this 1 second and ease in out. And if I now switch between these guys, you can actually see that the change between properties actually animates. Now, just to be clear, this is not quite as useful as it looks like here, because in reality, when you do serious layout with grids and so on, not all the properties in CSS are actually animatable, and some of the layout properties you cannot actually animate. So that works in some scenarios, but it certainly doesn't work universally. So let's see. I have 4 more seconds, so I'm going to... You know what? Just because I'm at it, I'm going to show you one more thing because it's kind of cool. Windows also comes with, like a lot of new JavaScript controls that are written in JavaScript and that do a lot of cool things. Like, for example, there are controls like these list views that you have seen probably in many demos that are really, really neat, and you can do lots of cool stuff with it. And the problem with controls when they are written in JavaScript is usually that it's all code and you can only configure them, by doing a JSON block and things like that, and that's just really not particularly nice. And in the way how controls work in Windows, they are actually toolable. So what I want to do is I want to take a simple really, really simple control. I want people to be able to rate my app and tell me how cool it is. So I'm going to add a rating control to this thing. Let me just add this here. It has been now added here in the corner, which is not particularly useful. So let me make this absolutely positioned. And now I can just drag this control somewhere over here and make it a bit bigger. And let's zoom in. You go away. So if I now switch to my HTML attributes panel, we know enough about these controls in terms of metadata that we can actually provide UI that lets you configure this control visually without having to go into HTML or into JSON or into JavaScript. So for example, if I want to say, hey, I don't want to have 5 stars for this control, but I want to have 10, I can just drag on this slider, and if I want my average rating, to be set, I can just do it this way. And this is incredibly cool. The control model that we have, it uses just standard HTML. There's nothing non-standard about it. There's no extension to HTML required to make that work. It just gives us the ability to visually configure and work with controls, which is a real powerful feature. All right, that is pretty much it for demos. So let me go back for 1 second to my slides. So what have you seen today? You've seen basically the basics concepts of visual authoring of HTML and CSS-based UI for a Metro-style app. You've seen how you can build really nicely factored and separated UI by just using, like CSS and CSS styling with blend and HTML modification on top of pure semantic UI-free markup and backing code, which is a really good design practice, which I can strongly recommend. You've seen a whole bunch of concrete techniques. You've seen how you can use CSS layout with CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox for creating resizable apps. You've seen styling of both static and JavaScript-generated UI. You've seen interactive mode and how it allows you to edit parts in an app that normally are never accessible to visual authoring tools in a nice way. Which is, I'm really in love with that feature. It is so cool. And you've seen CSS transition editing. And finally, you've seen a bunch of the Windows 8 specific things. You've seen how to design view states and orientations, and you've seen how to use Windows 8 controls. There's a lot more things to do in an app if you want to do a real cool Metro app, and I would really, if you're interested in that, recommend you to look at a bunch of these things. The Windows JavaScript controls, we barely scratched the surface of them. There's especially real cool stuff you can do with data-centric apps using the list view and grouped list view. It's amazing what you can do with these. There's all that stuff about the built-in JavaScript animations that Jensen talked about in his talk. Then there's asynchronous programming for making your app really responsive, Windows integration using the Windows runtime, using all the Windows contracts that you probably have heard about, and many other things, some of which you can do in Blend, some of which require code, but there's a lot you can do to make an app that is ultra polished and really attractive. Finally, we'd really love to hear from you about what we've shown you today. Remember, what you've seen, it's a preview. Change can and will happen. We're not done with that product, so your feedback and your input really matters, and there's lots of contact information on this slide. Thank you very much for coming, and have a great rest of the show.